mental spirit aspect. It's the same powerful familiar thing in the mind. There's like a hierarchy of these many covens, if you will.
Here we go. Hello, everybody. This is HEROparanormal, and I'm glad to have a very important and interesting guest. I respect him very much. It is Bruce Cornet, Dr. Bruce Cornet on the line. I think we still have him here. Are you there, Bruce?
Yes, I am, Ryan.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so happy to be able to have you on the podcast because I think you just bring such a amazing wealth of information to this genre, if you want to call it that. And I kind of wanted to see where this leads. We know that there's a lot going on with the To the Stars Academy, with a lot of UFOs in the news media. You have a rigorous and impressive background in the subject matter, and I just wanted to ask your opinion of what you think of all this. It's kind of a circus.
Yes, to a certain degree it is. And there have been a lot of questions as to what the objective of these disclosures are, and whether or not we can really trust them. One of the things that I'm aware of is that you're dealing with the intelligence community in much of this. And this has been pointed out by a number of different people. Don Greenwald and others have commented on this problem of just how much true information and how much disinformation is in these disclosures. This is a big question, but one of the things that seems to be quite certain is that they're trying to now get the public's interest in the phenomenon in order to raise the level of not just awareness, but support for additional funding for such research by the government and by agencies like To the Stars Academy. So there is a certain amount of interest in the financing of all of this that goes on, and which is always a big problem with this type of research. And there are still a lot of people out there that are unaware of the phenomenon, or who do not believe that we are being visited or have been visited. Although, if you think about it, the various History Channel and Travel Channel documentaries on the subject is quite spectacular. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Occasionally, from time to time, during the 80s and 90s, we had events, documentaries on the subject. I think the one that got me started was the miniseries on television called Intruders, based on Bud Hopkins' work, and was supported by Dr. John Mack. And I, at the time, had not been aware that such interest in abductions was taking place. As somebody who worked in academia and was a professional scientist, we never talked about this type of material. And that's going to be the biggest challenge for the government, is to get the scientific community to accept funded research in this subject.
Very well put. I couldn't agree more. I think this is really, it's come to a head. It seems like a lot of, it almost seems like it could redefine a lot of things, religion among other things, depending on people's views. And it also, I think, religion was on one course, and this is just my opinion, and then there was a fork in the road and science went on another course. And it almost seems that through quantum theory, this parts of science, or at least those areas dealing with quantum mechanics and such, are starting to kind of make that turn over to, I don't want to say towards religion, but some of the more esoteric or older views that were written in past times. do you think that's just perception on my behalf, or is there any legitimacy to that?
No, not perception at all. Back in 1991, I was exposed to something that was quite extraordinary. My late wife, she died, and over her grave, on video camera, she appeared in spirit and then was beamed up in a beam of golden light into a second sun at 8:30 in the morning. And later, when computer processing came, I could capture images from the video, and I was able to reveal a huge circular dome-shaped white mothership embedded in that cloud. And at the time, I did not realize that I had been abducted back in 1981. It wasn't until 1992 that my awakening came. And so what this did for me was to connect our spiritual existence with ETs. Mm-hmm. And that was profound for me. And then I was led to one contact after another with other individuals who were literally, they claimed that they were working with this group that I was working with, or who were abducting me. And they basically, one of them gave me a book called Genesis by David Wood, published in 1986. And when I read that, I was blown away. I had never been exposed to the esoteric subject and all of the different symbols that come out of ancient Egypt and Sumeria and Babylonia. And it was profound. I, had no clue. And I developed a web page called The Original Sin, in which I reveal my concepts of what I learned from reading that book and other articles on the same subject. So that, yes, in reply to your question, is how much does the esoteric relate to all of this? I would say that's just one of the languages that has been used for those who do not want authorities, especially the church, to know what they're saying and what they're talking about. And there's a lot of a connection between all of the religions that derived from Abraham and this invisible world that we are now being exposed to. And with the question is, who are the gods of our ancestors? Are they truly spiritual entities, divine entities, or is it possible they could just simply be extraterrestrial groups that are interacting with humans on Earth?
Yes, and that I think a lot of it comes down to semantics. A lot of individuals have what used to be related to and spoken of as celestial beings in the air are now seen as UFOs or aerial threats, more nuts and bolts, when in reality we have possibly something more than that.
Yes, much more. The Free Organization, started by Edgar Mitchell, and now headed by Ray Hernandez, who was with his team put together this questionnaire, this book, 800 pages of questionnaires that were, they analyzed them and basically said that the nuts and bolts aspect of this phenomena is very small. So no more maybe than 15 to 20%, where the rest of it is not nuts and bolts as we know it. And therein lies the big gap between science and what is going on. That the science has to come to accept the idea that there are things in our reality, parts of our reality, that are invisible and can only be detected through technology and instrumentation. I mean, without radio waves, and we would not have our communication. We would not be talking on cell phones and internet communication through not only through fiber optics, but also through the air. This is all technology that we've only really mastered in the last 100 years. So what is really out there, we don't know. And science wants to stick to the nuts and bolts. It wants physical evidence that it can capture and put under a microscope or analyze in a lab. And many of these phenomena that include ghosts and orbs and interdimensional portals and dimensions, we don't yet have the ability to resolve them in such a way that scientists can work with them. But I think that's in part just an illusion, a delusion on the part of scientists and the government, which has not wanted them to investigate these phenomena. That's part of the problem.
Yes. And if it's okay, I'd like to go back to a comment you said about this book that you mentioned. I believe you said it was Genesis.
Correct.
Now, would that be referring to that generation of Isis, or is that?
Yes.
Okay.
It means the genes of Isis. And a sequel book by Wood and Campbell, this would have been about, I would say 9 years later, it's called Geneset, and the genes of Set. And they get very much into the mythologies of ancient Egypt and of Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Osiris, mm-hmm. all of that. But those are the subjects that are common to many secret societies, everywhere from the Masons to the Rosicrucians to the Knights Templar. They all study those ancient myths, and they have their own interpretations of them. And Wood and Campbell came out in their books with some unique and very astounding interpretations that just blew me away. And I began to realizing that when you're including the area of Rennes-le-Château in southern France, a lot of amazing stuff is tied to that. There's been a number of programs on the Travel Channel, History Channel, on the Rennes-le-Château mystery and how it relates to all of this, because it connects to the idea that Jesus, after he was resurrected, stayed on earth, came back to earth, and with Mary Magdalene, they went off and lived in an area near Rennes-le-Château, and they had a whole family, mm-hmm. and that there was that there are bloodlines from Jesus that still exist today. This was the main underlying purpose for all of this, these books, is to trace the lineage of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, mainstream has caught on a little bit with the Dan Brown work, and I think, people are a little bit aware of some of these things. However, the mainstream has really looked at it more from an entertainment perspective than a actual esoteric perspective, or the way the teachings were really meant to be offered. If you were to make any correlations or comparisons, let's say if there was some cross-pollination between our current situation with the To the Stars Academy and the possible, I really liked what you said about the funding. I do really think this has to do with money in many respects, and the funding that may be needed for things like Space Force. Is there a connection there?
With the esoteric? Secret societies?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some word with, Tom DeLonge has spoken some about speaking with these high-level government people who he will not mention, but many believe they know who they are. And they have mentioned to Tom, whether he's being used by them or not, that there are some things from the esoteric that were involved. For example, the Atlantean quote-unquote myth is not as mythical as many believe, and other things. Do you think this could be related in any way to the possible funding of Space Force, although we have kind of a bipartisan, from what I understand, some are leaning more to the left, some are more to the right. But in reality, with this subject matter, I think it's important to just erase those lines because so much is being lost in the back and forth.
Right, in the identification of who's involved and why. But one thing that does stand out is, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this, is that many people in government who work to enforce the laws of our country belong to these secret societies, the Masons in particular, but also the Knights Templar. And this has always fascinated me, and that these organizations, for the most part, the secret information, the important information that is talked about in Genesis and Geneset, those books, most of the members of these societies are unfamiliar with them. You only get to know these truths, if you will, when you get up into the high rank, the 32nd, 33rd degrees of these societies. And so the information is kept very close to their chest and not revealed. And but then again, you have the other side of it, is that if you want to belong to these societies, you have to literally swear on oath that you will always keep their information secret. You will not reveal any of it to any outsiders. And if ever asked, you will say, I don't know. No, that never happened. That's not correct. In other words, you will mislead people into thinking that you really don't have access to this information. And that's one of the things I studied, and I was rather fascinated by what the overall implications are. Is that who's really in control, Ryan? Who's, we all think about humans as being in control, but I wonder if there's something even more than that. Of course, those who are in religion will say, oh yes, well, you have God and all of his angels. But that can be debated as to who is God.
Yes, and I really like the information is power aspect of this. As you said, if this information is so highly regarded that it is secretive and that it isn't being shared, then this information really is power. And if it's being used by the classes that are governing the majority of the population, I think that's evidence in itself. However, on a slightly different topic, the capstone, the missing capstone really to the pyramids that we often see, is this something that could be an example of that otherworldly power I believe we're alluding to, possible extraterrestrial, celestial, or otherwise unseen governance that is being, well, for lack of a better word, in charge?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The capstone, by it missing, implies that authority is invisible to us. It is secret, and only those who are in direct communication with those entities know of its existence. So we have that potential problem of in disclosure. Could disclosure of the stuff that we can see, the nuts and bolts that we can videotape and photograph, will that lead people then to want to know, okay, well, who's running the show, and could expose more of who's really behind all of this? But I think personally, Ancient Aliens has brought a lot of this out and shown us through reinterpreting archaeological evidence that there is that the gods, so to speak, did walk among us in ancient societies, and they did help us, teach us how to build pyramids and other architectural marvels. And that is important to know that we are now in a period where we could go back to a time when they are walking among us again. And I have to ask the question, well, why do we have to think that they haven't come back? In my own personal research and understanding, and from what I've learned, they've never left. They've always stayed here, they've always been here. And they've just stayed out of our view and in the shadows, so to speak, in their underground bases, undersea bases, and orbital ships. They have stayed invisible to most of us. And revealing that, when it comes out, is going to shake up a lot of people. Because even though we see a great interest now in the subject of UFOs or UAP, as I like to call them, the problem is that this only is what people can see who are those who are standing up and saying, "Count me in." Otherwise, a large majority of people still are unaware that this is all taking place. They, when they see a news item about the government, about the Navy and naval pilots talking about UFOs, they just close their ears and turn to another channel. They don't want to deal with that subject. They think it's ridiculous. It is not happening, and it's so. Where do you go when you have to educate the majority of people, enough people, if the government wants public support for more funding?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it reminds me so much of some of the comments you said remind me so much of the interview with Bob Bigelow, the famous interview with Bob Bigelow. For those who are not familiar with Mr. Bigelow, he is probably the person, at least in our generation, that has done the most to study this out of his own pocket. And I believe his words were along the lines of, yes, they are here, and they're right under our nose, and people laughed at him, and I was offended that some of the public found that amusing, but
ludicrous,
right, and getting back to this funding, is there a possibility, in your opinion, that these, let's call them disclosure movements, and there's many, we don't have to use their names, there are very different movements that have different theories, and they all seem to have government connections. Is there a possibility that this is in some way, shape, or form similar to like what was seen in the 50s with control of the narrative?
Oh yes, absolutely. Government, if it can't remain in control, is not government. Correct?
Correct.
It has to have control of not just the narrative, but of the people, and of the. We're coming to a time when you're having a rift between science, the science of archaeology, and also the facts that are being investigated again now by new investigators. The so-called ancient astronaut theorists, who are looking at things in a different light, are coming up with radically new interpretations that go very much against what is in the textbooks that you'll learn if you go to college and major in archaeology and anthropology. You'll get a very different view by mainstream science. And now they're finding out that a lot of these things that we thought were true are really not. For example, Dr. Bruce Fenton has come out with a book, Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution, in which he gives evidence that the oldest humans now have been documented in Australia, long before the time that we ever had any emigration out of Africa. You're talking about many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago. and the humans' existence is being pushed back further and further, and we're finding that those early humans, Homo sapiens, walked among many other species very similar to us, who could interbreed with us, and thus there was a very mixed origin of humans, 30 to 100,000 years ago, that most theorists in academia have not yet come to accept. They're still of this idea that man evolved in Africa and it came out of Africa. For now, Bruce Fenton is saying, no, the evidence now points to Australia, and that they moved up through the Indonesia and islands, and then into Eastern Asia, and spread through Asia, then down into Africa, and then there was the Mount Toba supervolcanic explosion around 70,000 years ago that wiped out almost all of them, and the remnant human survivors in southernmost Africa and several other places around the world, they repopulated the world, but that was only after a bottleneck in human evolution, where some theorists say, basing on genetic tracing all of the different races of humans back to the so-called Adam and Eve, the first humans, that happened about the same time that Mount Toba explosion occurred, and it also indicated that human genome or population was reduced to as little as 5,000 to 10,000 individuals, and from that, those survivors we came from there out of Africa. And that is pretty amazing when you think about it, that our history is so different, and the truth may be so different from what the experts in human evolution think actually happened.
I think that's just fascinating. It reminds me of that common saying that the history is written by the victors. You don't have to go back very many generations before people will just tend to forget this. And yeah, I just think that's fascinating. Absolutely. I mean, much like the Library of Alexandria and other places that we've seen more recently, unfortunately, some of them by our own hand, places that have just, and ISIS as well. I mean, I'm not talking about obviously the deity, but the group, the terror group. It seems like erasing parts of these cultures and history is a tool that has worked very well in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like in Cambodia, when all of the intellectuals were slaughtered by Pol Pot or whoever he was back then, and during the Vietnam War, I mean, it was mass genocide of intellectuals in order to rewrite history. And we've seen this time and time again on this planet. Even the biblical example of the Great Flood to remove all of the human and humanoid populations that existed prior to that, even though many of them still survived that we now know in isolated areas. That there's just, the more we discover, the more we dig, the more we're going to find, and we're going to have to revise our story about where we came from and when. That is for certain. And one of the things that I got involved with, Ryan, when in the early 90s, I was introduced to Richard Hoagland at the time, and I became part of his moon team. He had already published everything on Mars, the Cydonia complex, etc., and I helped him do some productions, and I was the cameraman for him on a number of his moon talks, for example, at Ohio State University. And but at that time, I was going through my awakening as to what my relationship was to our visitors and who they were, and I was discovering that I was connected to them in a much more intimate fashion than I could ever possibly have imagined. As I had said earlier, that I recorded the spirit of my late wife over her grave as it ascended in a golden beam of light into a second sun, and then discovered that there was a huge white mothership embedded in that overhead cloud, that began to resonate with me, that somehow my late wife was connected to our visitors. And then she came back in spirit, and we communicated, and we've communicated ever since. And she taught me many, many things. And I'm not afraid to reveal this because I do reveal it in a number of my publications online, and that she was one of the main entities that was running this whole show. Mm-hmm. And that was a surprise. On the 23rd of October 1994, I was introduced to two of my three hybrid children, who were born before either Bonnie or I had lost our virginity by typical, ET manipulation. I was abducted for a sperm sample. She became pregnant as a virgin at age 17. And then after 4 months pregnancy, suddenly her pregnancy was ended. And we know what happens now with all that's being revealed about alien hybrid interaction with humans. And I was introduced to two of my three children in astronaut suits floating in space next to an alien in a different type of decompression suit over my bed. This was a projection from space, a live projection in which they were moving and looking at me, and I was moving around and looking at them through this two-dimensional screen. And after this vision was over, I woke my wife, who was sleeping under all of this, and she said I woke her in the middle of a dream about me meeting my children. And I said, well, they didn't tell me their names in the vision. And she said in the dream their names were Nora and Kyle. So this just kept on escalating over and over again, Ryan, with more and more contact. And it got to the point that I was wondering, who can I turn to? Mm-hmm. I mean, I really empathize with all of these people who are awakened to their abductions, and they can't go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. There's nobody out there other than other abductees that they can share their information with without ridicule or even, getting a label of being crazy. So I was in that type of a situation. My wife was having a hard time believing what I was telling her, and her children didn't believe what I was saying. So there was a lot of conflict going on at that time. And that is the time that I was traveling to Weehawken, New Jersey, to meet up with Hoagland and his team and seeing all of his evidence about the moon. So I was being bombarded with an enormous amount of information. This is about 30 years ago on all of what is now being revealed over and over again in order to educate the public. One of the things that I discovered when I was doing my geologic work there, this was actually before I met Hoagland. I wanted to map the area where all of these sightings of UAP were occurring near Pine Bush, New York. And so I borrowed a magnetometer from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and started a 24 square mile magnetic survey, which took me 3 years to complete, 1,800 different stations, and I generated a map which was very interesting. It showed that all of the UAP activity was associated with magnetic anomalies below ground. And Ellen Crystal, in her book, 1991 book, Silent Invasion, said that she thought there was an underground base. Why? Because she would see ships diving, or these lights diving into the ground and no explosion, and others coming out of the ground. And she saw many pieces of evidence that there was something going on under the ground. And during my 11 years involvement in field work, I confirmed all of her suspicions, but I had the scientific data, the magnetic map that substantiated that indeed there is underground activity that is unlikely to be caused by humans. And so, but in the process of doing that, I started discovering features on the surface. As a geologist who had done a lot of mapping, I started finding remnants of monuments and features on Earth that match the features and the monuments in the Cydonia complex on Mars. And this was largely came out of the fact that Richard Hoagland had given a talk before the United Nations on the Silbury Hill and Avebury Circle in England, associated with all the UFO activity there. And he had said that these monuments were like a 1/6 version of the crater and the tholus on Earth. And I had already done something, mapped the area around Pine Bush, and found remnants of a huge crater that nobody else had discovered before. And I was amazed because during the last ice age, the glaciers came down that valley and toppled any structures more than maybe 50 feet tall. So if all those pyramids that are in the Cydonia complex of Mars, all that would remain on Earth would be their basis. And when I realized this, and after I had mapped this circular crater, I called Hoagland and I said, "What is the width of that crater on Mars?" And he said 2.3 miles. And I had already mapped it, and I knew that the one I had identified was 2.3 miles in diameter. Then I asked him, "What is the latitude of that crater on Mars?" And he said, "Contact his geologist," and I did. And it turned out to be the same latitude as the one on Mars. They were both at 41 degrees 36 minutes. What is the probability of that? Once I had gotten that confirmation, I said, okay, let me try to find the tholus, because in his talk to the United Nations, he had emphasized Avebury Circle and the Silbury Hill, which represented the tholus. And I went off in the compass direction where I would expect it to be, and I found it. The tholus on Earth is beautifully preserved, and the Stewart International Airport and Army and Air Force Base is built on top of it, and it's well preserved along with its satellite mount. Okay, that could just be coincidence, I thought. Let me then go for the big one, the face. Let's see if the face is still existing on Earth. So I went off in that direction. I had my topographic sheets all pieced together, and with my ruler down there, Hoagland's geologist, Jim Javik, had sent me a map that he had created for the Cydonia complex on Mars, and I was able to measure the direction and the distance. And when my ruler measuring came to an end, I was staring at a face on Earth that was the mirror image of that on Mars. I mean, even though it's highly eroded, you can still make out the forehead, the eye sockets, the nose, the mouth, the chin, etc. It's all there. And it's in the exact right position where it should be. At that particular point, I said, oh my God, let me go try to find the DNM pyramid, which I realized would have been toppled because that pyramid would have been close to, twice the height of the Giza pyramids. Have been around 1,000 feet tall. And when I laid it out and looked for an area where the pyramid base could be, I found it near Warwick, New York, and it was the right size, right orientation, 5-sided area that was between mountains and hills in the Wallkill River Valley. Then I said, okay, let me go try to find the City of Pyramids. Lo and behold, I found them. I found that Pine Island was built on the base of a 6-sided pyramid on Mars is the largest 6-sided pyramid in that City of Pyramids. And so we have a whole town built on top of the base of what could be a huge pyramid that existed at that point before the glaciers removed it. And I did a major website, which is now on the BUFOD website over in the UK. It's called the Cydonia 2 Report. And it's had quite a history of up and down. but the information is still there. What concerns me, Ryan, is that very few people have recognized this as being significant or important, and it almost seems to speak of individual egos of people that don't want me to undercut their own expertise and authority on this, because the implications are that the Cydonia complex on Mars is a copy of the one on Earth that was built when the civilization that existed here on Earth before the last ice age began to realize that the ice age would destroy their monuments in New York. So they built a template, a duplicate on Mars, so that when we recover from our the destruction of that civilization and get back to exploring our solar system with probes, we would discover that complex. And lo and behold, that's exactly what I recognized and used to find all of the remnants of those monuments here on Earth. So really, did we come from Mars, or did Martians come from us? Which is which? Which came first? I was able to date the Cydonia complex on Earth the one on Mars, when it was built based on tectonic plate movement, and the distance that of the center of the craters on both are just enough apart that I was able to estimate that the one on Mars was built right before the end of the last interglacial, the Eemian interglacial, about 118,500 years ago. So everything is fitting into an amazing connection. Are you still there?
It really is. It's fascinating. Absolutely. I'm fascinated by the amount of research you put into these subjects that, in my opinion, are the most important of our time, Bruce. Kudos. There's so many directions I could go here, but I wanted to ask you back to the possibility of hybridization. Is there a possibility we're all hybrids?
Absolutely. I think we all have DNA that did not come from our primate origins. I think that we are of primate origins, which is why there is such a close connection, a genetic connection between us and chimpanzees and apes, etc. But the functional genes in our 46 chromosomes are very few compared to the number of genes that don't seem to have any function. So where did they come from and why? There's a lot of room for including non-human DNA, and now they're finding these long-skulled individuals in Paracas and in Eden and other places of the world, and getting DNA results from them that show that were not 100% human. There were other types of DNA genes in those individuals, and so the question becomes, where did those come from? We're still in the dark as far as how many different types of humanoid Homo species existed in the past, so you can't yet rule out that they were not just hybrids between different types of hominid species that had evolved on Earth. But at the same time, one has to wonder why their DNA corresponds in Paracas with those in Central Asia, in Europe, and in Scotland, where they're finding where humans' DNA, is very similar. How did they get there, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, at a time when we supposedly, according to the archaeologists, were not traversing the seas? But of course, that paradigm is collapsing now that they're finding more and more evidence that our ancestors before the sextant were able to get across the oceans quite well and find their way around to various islands in the Pacific, and that European DNA has been found in colonies or remnants of humans or groups on the East Coast, and they're finding more evidence that there are other types of Asians that made it over to the Americas, including Africans. Of course, the Olmecs in Central America. Where did they come from? So my word is one of caution, that we do not have enough evidence yet to really know what was going on in the past, and to think that there were no advanced high-tech civilizations in the past is just blatant ignorance on those people's part. That we've been told in ancient literature that human civilizations have gone through cycles after cycles after cycles, and now more and more evidence is coming up to support that. So that we've gone through boom and bust periods of high-tech spacefaring, and then back to hunting, gathering, and living in caves over and over again.
Yes. And so much of what you're saying is resonating with me that I have so many questions, but we're on such a limited time schedule. Let me ask you, you mentioned the something I'm fascinated by is the magnetic anomalies underground. And, many different people have mentioned this with connections to the Anunnaki, with DUMBs, or deep underground military bases. In your opinion, is there a possibility that we, or those who govern us more likely, our governments, are working together with possible non-human entities in some of these locations?
Very good question. A very relevant question today. One of the problems I had when I was in the field working with all of the sightings, I had over 137 close encounters with these ships. And many of them you could see the physical shapes, the angular shapes of these, from triangles to diamond shape. And you could see that they had a physical component to them, even though I also did experiments that showed that the images that we captured, both visually and with on our cameras, could be manipulated so that they could present to us what they wanted us to see. And excuse me. So the question became, how far advanced are we in our own technology that we could do what they're doing? And when I would actually photograph these large ships, the size of a 747, diving through a forest without interacting with the trees and disappearing below ground, what the heck? If we have that type of technology, why do we still use rockets? This is absurd. But then you get all of this disinformation coming out about us having this technology, about skunkworks having triangular craft that can fly, and in discussing this with Dr. Jack Safadi, especially on an interview which was on Star Drive report about a couple months ago, the thing that he pointed out is that the triangular craft do not operate, their propulsion system is very different from that of the Tic Tac, and that is now being revealed by To the Stars Academy and ATIP, etc. This is important because if you have multiple ways of defying gravity, okay, the implication is that our government and secret military has achieved success in some of these areas, but not in all of them. And so the question I had in the field is, are these things that I'm seeing merely government-sponsored entertainment for the sky watchers in rural roads around Pine Bush? And I had to come to the conclusion, no, these are quite different. But then you have these communities living underground, and I've identified several areas where there are underground bases. our CIA, doesn't our government already know about them? And the amazing thing is that many people I've witnessed said that they have encountered humans coming out of the ground and out of tunnels and opening up hatches and coming out where these bases are located. So one has to ask the question, are we cooperating with them, or are they cooperating with us? I mean, when you have a huge military complex in the Wallkill River Valley at Stewart Airport, and then you have an underground base that is very extensive, that it extends for many tens of miles, if not hundreds of miles, how in the world could they coexist in the same space, so to speak, without knowing of each other's existence? And with bits and pieces of information that have come out from various sources, my suspicion is that they are very well aware of what's going on with these underground ET groups. And they may, in fact, be working, some divisions within our military may be working with them. We keep on hearing this information from various sources. So I don't have a confirmed answer on this, but I just have a suspicion.
It would only make sense, right?
Right. That one of the objectives of our military would be to make contact and to get cooperation. And even though the non-humans may be sharing some of their information, they're not sharing the most critical information that we could turn into weapons. So that's one of the big differences, that there has to be a separation of these technologies. Otherwise, and another thing that the military would want, the CIA would want to do, is to get us to pretend that these ships that are being seen by hundreds of people in the Pine Bush area during the 1990s, thousands of people, in fact, that they somehow were connected to our secret military hardware, because they wouldn't want our enemies to know that they had this technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that would make us an even greater threat to Russia and China if we had this technology. Just as a recent article I saw coming out, the Russians are admitting that they have some of this technology themselves. And so eventually it's going to have to come out that we are all have been researching and studying this phenomena, and that it gets very complicated very fast.
It does. I'm very intrigued by the aspects, like you mentioned, with a lot of these UAPs, UFOs, and aerial phenomena, how many observers, and this is everywhere from the Uinta Basin of Utah across the globe, a lot of these craft, as you mentioned, are seen flying directly into ridge lines, directly into structures, directly into the ground. And is this a scenario where our rules just don't apply to them? Or could it be more of a live projection, Project Bluebeam type scenario?
Well, I've thought about that. Is this all just illusion? Is that's what they are wanting us to think and believe? And one can never rule that out. But at the same time, I have been abducted. And back in 1981 at my drill site, and my crew saw me being abducted. They found me missing, and they saw me being brought back. And when I was hypnotically regressed, I recalled how they touched my head with a wand, and a vibration went through me. And suddenly I was no longer part of the matter of this world, and they just passed me through the wall of this trailer along with themselves. And so, and that freaked me out when I recalled that, seeing the physical wall of this trailer pass through my body and not even feel it. So they have this technology of changing the vibrational nuclear frequencies of atoms so that they no longer recognize the atoms of our material world. And that is how they can pass through the ground into their underground bases, is that they no longer are part of this world. You could call them interdimensional or quasi-dimensional, that they just sidestep the issue of interaction with our matter. And yet this interaction sometimes is incomplete, and that's one of the reasons why we have, like the Daryl Sims, finding fingerprints or handprints or body prints on doors and walls of where the ETs passed through them. They hadn't been completely separated or isolated from our matter, and thus they interacted with it a little bit and left a residue that could be studied. And so I don't think it's an illusion. I think they're very much capable of disappearing into a parallel dimension or creating a parallel dimension where they can hide, and that's how they could cloak themselves and disappear, and maybe only their lights we would see, whereas their physical ships were invisible.
Fascinating. I'm glad that you really spoke and brought up the vibration aspect, because in speaking with another person who worked in really side by side with you, they had mentioned to me at one point that certain hertz and certain vibrations were more effective when trying to visualize these entities. And it reminds me so much of the Hermetic law of vibration, that everything has a different vibration. And I could totally see how this, especially dealing with something that is able to do that, would be explicable by that form.
Exactly.
And on another, this is one that it gets a lot of traction online. This just came out yesterday, and I'm sure you're aware of it. You're very in the know, Bruce. This older alien autopsy video, and then someone has leaked in some way, shape, or form email communications between different individuals, and they're trying to find a correlation or verify something. I'm fairly sure that the alien autopsy video that most of us are familiar with may not be a complete or exactly legitimate or perfect picture of what is being communicated in these email communications. I'm wondering if you've heard anything about this or seen anything about this online, and what your opinion would be on this.
Okay. I have seen a little bit of it, but then back when the alien autopsy videos came out, there was a lot of debate all the way from one extreme to the other, that it was all fake, special effects by people who worked with the Hollywood film industry, and also that it could actually be real. There are just a lot of pieces of evidence that somebody wanted us to think that these aliens' bodies were real. That is obvious. But at the same time, was this in order to pull the rug out from under us, so that it would get people to say, yes, it's real, they are real, and then they'd suddenly reveal the fake aspects of it. But then again, the disinformation groups that don't want people to accept this as reality would want to go to that extent to create questions in our minds. But one thing that stands out with all of this, Ryan, is that in 1990, before I had any information on UFOs or even knew that I was an abductee, I saw a TV program when I was living in New York with my family in Middletown that was stunning. I couldn't believe that they were showing this at like 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning. And it was a documentary on an alien autopsy in which they showed x-rays and diagrams of the internal organs and these two people were talking very intelligently about this being a real organism that they had studied, and they were presenting this information to the public, but at a time when very few people would be watching. And that was surprising. It was like this was one of the first shows in order to try to get this information out and prepare the public for considering that, you know, there are other humanoids on this planet that are not human and don't look human. I mean, I've heard a lot of interesting subjects. I mean, Linda Moulton Howe has access to a tremendous amount of information on leaked stories about these ETs, and a lot of it you just have to, you know, question about, well, where's the evidence? Let's see the evidence. Yes, we have these people saying that some of the greys don't even have a digestive tract or a mouth or you know, have ears or anything like that. And how do they operate? How were they energized? By what type of system? Or are they just robots? So there are a lot of questions we have yet to answer. And my realization is that disclosure is going to have to be a drip, 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 because there's just simply so much information out there. And once it reaches a certain threshold of people accepting that this phenomenon is real, we're going to get fewer and fewer skeptics, although you can easily pick out a skeptic by how strongly and emotionally he fights against the acceptance of certain data. And, well...
This is true.
So, as far as the alien autopsy, I don't know. I must admit that back in 1995, I was featured in the first issue of a journal called Encounters. And on the front of it, it shows the picture of that alien. So I'm forever now connected to that image of the alien autopsy. So
neat.
There it goes.
And I have to go back to this disinfo. You know, people hear this term, and I don't think they realize that this is one of the most powerful tools in the tool set that those in positions of power are using. Instead of getting an agenda across on its own merits, it's much easier to take the other agenda and put out a very hack job, if you will, something that can easily be debunked. And then you automatically gain traction for the agenda you're working at.
Right.
And it's just such a powerful tool in the tool set of the elite or the governing powers. And I feel like we're all aware that it happens from time to time, but we don't, you know, when I speak to people like yourself and individuals who really know how things work, in my opinion, you understand just how powerful that is.
Hold on. I have somebody at the door.
Of course.
I'll be right back.
This tends to happen when you have these conversations of importance. Hopefully we hear back.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, great.
Sorry.
I'm glad you're back. Going off of that, I also wanted to speak a little bit more about Lockheed recently has had an actual partnership that's been rumored with the TTSA, or the To the Stars Academy, in a limited capacity, which I found very interesting. And of course, my initial response was, well, this could be what Tom has alluded to, that they plan on actually reverse engineering a craft with the help of individuals with the right connections, and they have alloys from fallen spacecraft or non-earthly metals. And I believe Art's Parts is actually one that is undeniably been accepted by multiple organizations as being legitimate. So there's some validation there. is Lockheed going to be able to actually do this? Is this just something that a lot of people are anticipating and hoping for?
Well, first off, as I said earlier on in our interview, is that there are more than one way of neutralizing or gaining lift against gravity. Okay, there's just not one single way. Apparently, there are multiple different mechanisms and technologies that can achieve this. But the one thing that I do know is, what Jack Safadi told me. He said that the TR-3B that supposedly was developed by the Lockheed Skunk Works does exist. It is functional. And whereas it's not what the Tic Tac is that was viewed playing games with the fighter pilots of the Navy, and that they operate on completely different principles, that the hull of the Tic Tac, based on material supposedly recovered from the Roswell crash, is a metamaterial of micro-layered elements and alternating layers that literally has the effect of slowing light down to zero. And with that, once light, we're not talking about the absorption of photons. We're talking about slowing the speed of light down to zero, that gravity goes to zero within these metamaterial hulls of the ship. And that it just changes everything and isolates these ships from our reality, much in the same way I was discussing earlier about how they can change the frequency of everything and pass me through a wall of a trailer. They can do this with these metamaterial hulls. And one of the ways that I was able to come up with what Jack Safadi called a smoking gun was when I recorded the sounds that these craft made. Most of these craft do not have to make any sound and don't make any sound. But one thing that they did in their performances at Pine Bush was to produce sounds like that of a jet engine and try to mimic the nighttime lighting patterns, navigation lights of jets. And we would fly over us, and most of the people there that were witness to this say, "Oh, it's just a jet." And that fooled me a lot too. But I recorded this material, so did Ellen Crystal, and through the audio recordings, we discovered that you have reverse Doppler. The Doppler effect is beautifully reversed. And this is not normal. This is very anomalous how this happens. And what they've found out through experiments with developing metamaterials made up of many different micro layers and elements is that these metamaterials cause sound to reverse. And you have a reverse Doppler effect. So there's a connection here that when I was recording these sounds that to the human ears sounded like maybe a turbofan jet engine, but then I looked at the whole spectrogram. It wasn't. The sound frequencies were composed of multiple separate bands, as many as 10 to 12 individual frequencies bundled together, and that the overall frequency of these bands decreased as the sound source approached the microphone. And after it passed over and was moving away, the sound frequencies increased as the sound source moved further and further away. And I have many, many recordings like this. And this is what Jack Safadi said is indication that the ships had metamaterial hulls and that they were operating much like the Tic Tac in the way their capability. But the TR-3B, now that's an interesting story, because on the 17th of May, 1997, three of us were positioned on Muddy Kill Lane waiting for something to happen, and it did. We were given a performance by a triangular craft and recorded on both video and on time exposures. I have a whole website on it. That later, that Mark Whitford, who was one of the people there, he is a naval veteran. He said in one of his contacts, called him up and told him that we had been given a demonstration of the performance of the TR-3B. It had been authorized by the government, and that a skunkworks pilot would give us a demonstration of it. And if you can believe that, that's pretty amazing. If indeed that video that is online shows the TR-3B and what it's capable of doing and how it's able to rotate and upside down and fly away upside down and backwards and then flip over and decrease in speed as it's moving down, it's ascending towards the ground, and all of these other things that was able to do, and it was all caught on video. So then that raises the question, okay, what is what? Who has what technology?
Exactly. Wow, man. Bruce, I'm just speechless at a lot of this, and I feel we're all so very lucky to have you disseminate the rigorous research that you've dedicated much of your life to. I really appreciate you being with us for the last hour, Bruce. And
thank you, Ryan. I much appreciate your having me on your show.
Where can people find more of your work, research contributions, and support your efforts, websites, books, etc.?
Right now, I have a number of websites out there. You just have to do Google Bruce Cornet and look for Monmouth Internet or my website, and click on there, and there are links to many different web pages at that point. And I have one called Serious Onion Works that you can do that and come up with my web pages. But I'm in the middle of finalizing the final editing on a book that I've just completed. It's about 386 pages long, and it's unfortunately it's going to be in black and white and probably published by Kindle or an Amazon. And I also have an appendix associated with that and linked so that people can copy the link in the book when it comes out and go to my online site. It's over 300 pages of a listing of all my sightings and documented by date, time, location, and what it involved and the witnesses that were present. And you're dealing with a total of 141 encounters and over a period of 11 years. So that's going to be my all of my data out there for everybody to see and to ponder what the heck's going on here. I mean, why were these craft and lights putting on such shows time and time again for my cameras and for other sky watchers out there? That's a big question, is what was this? Was this part of the ET disclosure, independent of government? That's another interesting question. I mean, we even had, I was out there in the field with Ellen Crystal for many times, many nights, and she was contacted by the Sightings television series at the time, 1993, and on the 29th of April, 1993, with the Sightings TV camera crew out there with us, we had 6 ships put on performances for those cameras. I mean, they came at us, flipped over, passed us, right over the tops of us, curved back, dove, and disappeared into the ground. Okay? Time and time again. Doing right-angle turns. The manta ray, as it came at us, banked towards us and passed in front of us at 29 miles per hour, 30 miles an hour at the most, with its flat shape vertical to the ground. So it couldn't have been a conventional aircraft, because planes can't fly with their wings vertical to the ground. And it passed us with screaming, all sorts of turbine sounds, and putting out all sorts of lights. And the sad part about this, Ryan, was that the show, when it came on, only had one still photograph of that manta ray displayed on the show. They had the entire video, of what happened, but it was probably too extreme, they thought, for the American public, or more likely, the government said, don't show it.
Wow. Wow. So amazing. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. You are a master of your craft. I just want to thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Ryan.
Bruce Cornet, ladies and gentlemen. Definitely support his work. He's done a lot of it. Thank you so much for being with us. Sorry, I kept him for about 20 minutes over, but I think it was definitely worth it, and I appreciate him staying on with us. And until next time, guys, keep your eyes to the skies.
Hierarchy, so many cousins, if you will, cousin cousins, if you will.